all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joining you today from the Franklin Humanities Institute on Duke University's campus, and we are joined by E. Patrick Johnson, the Dean of the School of Communications and the Annenberg Professor of Performance Studies and African American Studies at Northwestern University. Professor Johnson, Dean Johnson, is the author of many books, particularly Appropriating Blackness, Performance, and the Politics of Authenticity, Duke University Press, 2003. Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, an Oral History, produced by University of North Carolina Press, 2008. Black Queer Southern Women, an Oral History, also published by UNC in 2018. And Honeypot, Black Southern Women Who Love Women, published by Duke University in 2019. He is also behind the one-man play, Sweet Tea.
I believe that it's wrong as far as right and wrong. I believe that God loves the homosexual, the person, but he hates what he do. There is power, 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 power.
And also the film, directed by our friend John Jackson, Making Sweet Tea.
I spent a lot of my years trying to accommodate others. What I lost was, who am I?
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be back.
Thank you.
Left to Black.
So you have the status now of being the person who's appeared on Left to Black the most.
Wow! I didn't know that.
This is your fourth appearance, and 3 times in studio, which is always wonderful. It speaks to a couple of things. One, your OG status. As we've all gotten to this point in our career where we've seen the folks before us move on, and we're looking at almost 2 generations of folks coming behind us. Let me ask you this question, right? Thinking about the boy that you were growing up in Hickory, North Carolina, did you ever imagine this?
I didn't. My mother says that she always knew that I was going to be a professor. I don't know how she knew that. And she said that because I always ask questions. She said, Pat was just always asking questions. Mama, why this? Mama, why that? So I was an inquisitive child. But, I didn't know that this would be on the path that I eventually got on, because people don't believe this, but I was a really shy child. I know.
That is a little unbelievable.
But I really was. I had stage fright, and my mother would put me in these talent shows, and I remember one time, the community in Hickory, the Black community, was called Ridgeview, and we had our own everything because it was during segregation. And at the rec center every year they had a talent show, and I remember one talent show in particular. I was maybe 6 or 7, and another neighbor, her daughter, whose name was Geraldine, they were going to make us like Flip Wilson and I don't know who she was playing. And they had our little outfits, whatever. We were going to do this little thing. I would not go on stage. My mom was so mad at me. But eventually, it was actually the church singing in the choir that sort of brought me out of my shell, because I was a soprano and kept my soprano voice well into my teenage years. And that became the kind of stage, if you will, for me to come out of my shyness. But looking back at that little boy in his oversized Easter suit, I had no idea.
Didn't you just post a picture?
I did. And my plaid oversized suit and my white tie. So yeah, it's been a real interesting journey, to say the least.
You did your undergraduate work at UNC. You eventually pursued your PhD at LSU. There are a whole generation of folks, colleagues of ours, right? Some of our cohort, some who later, who went through places like Mellon and Ford. I think of the two of us as kind of off the beaten path in terms, right? LSU, University of Buffalo. What did it mean to do this process and not go through it with, like a golden fork?
Yeah, all
right?
the accoutrements.
All the accoutrements that comes from coming through elite Ivy League schools and the kinds of apparatuses that were set up, right? I don't want to say to make it easier for our colleagues to make it through, but made them more legible, certainly, right, as they went through their careers.
Yeah. Well, again, I go back to my community in Hickory. It was a very small Black community, but very close-knit, and we all lived, in the same neighborhood. And it was abject poverty. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I grew up in a one-bedroom house, and I had 6 siblings, and it was my mother and I sleeping on the pull-out sofa, the pull-out couch, what we called it. And my siblings in the one bedroom with bunk beds.
And you were the youngest?
Bed. I'm the youngest. And there's a big age gap between myself and my oldest brother. It's 17 years.
Wow.
But we were scrappy, and we were poor, but we didn't act like we were poor. Mama Vaselined our faces and had our stuff together every Sunday morning. So while we were poor, that did not circumscribe our every part of our being. We were expected to go to school, to work. I got my first job at 14. And so any kinds of obstacles in my way, whether that was regarding education or pursuing anything, I feel like I had the skill set because of my upbringing. Yeah. And so me not having the benefit of, an elite institution, getting a PhD from an elite institution or getting one of the big grants, didn't bother me. And in some ways I felt that if you just do the work,
right,
the rest will come. And that really is what has happened.
Yeah. We, in previous weeks, have had Tracy Sharpley Whiting and also Ronaldo Walcott, two scholars that I think of as part of the cohort that we're in. I read all of you, think of you obviously in performance studies.
The same way your mom loves her husband, I feel the same way about other men. I don't know if you can understand this or not. More than likely, you'll probably be angry because you don't completely understand it. But come to me with that anger. To view the cross.
But we're all doing Black studies. Have you been surprised that Black studies has been as sustainable as it has been, or it seems to be? And what do you think are some of the real challenges that the field is going to face going forward? And that's not even considering all the anti-woke, anti-CRT dynamics. I mean, I think these were questions that were on the table before 2020, you know, if we're being honest.
Yeah. I'm not surprised that Black Studies is still around because I think with each generation, the young folk have taken up the mantle and run with it. And we see the next iteration of Black Studies. And it's interesting to think about hearing students today talk about the debates, and I'm like, these debates have been going on
Well,
for a
long
long time. Have you heard of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois? I think the difference is with Black studies in particular, and the debates, the discourse was going on before it was codified as a field of study. But that said, I think the difference between Black studies and other fields of study is that even with those debates, it was always about how to get Black people free.
Yeah.
What is the strategy
Right.
for getting us free? And thinking about Ronaldo Walcott's work, his latest work, distinguishing between freedom and emancipation. I think that's a really wonderful distinction, because being emancipated is not the same as being free.
Right.
But it speaks to how in Black studies, no matter what your ideological position is, it's always about how to get Black people free. And so that's why it's not surprising to me that Black studies is still around and in many instances thriving. And we fight amongst ourselves. I mean, I don't know of a Black studies program that don't have drama. Because that's what happens when you get Black people together. That's what we do.
Right.
It's like a family reunion, and everybody plays their role. You're going to talk bad about the person who brought the bad potato salad. And in terms of the twists and turns of what's going on now, I think it's really generative. I know that when I think about the late 1960s, when Black students were protesting on PWIs to have initially just more courses in Black studies, and then that turned into departments. The kinds of questions that folks were asking are still relevant today. Even those questions around the whole, should we be at these white institutions? What roles do Black studies departments play? And why don't we just, why aren't we just at HBCUs? So that's a question. Another question has been, as we know, the role of sexuality within Black studies, the role of women in terms of the history that Black women have played. And now, Afro-pessimism is a perspective that's gotten a lot of attention in Black studies. So those debates going on. I think it's all generative. I think where we need to be careful is making sure that, and I tell my students this all the time, a theory is just that.
A theory, right.
A theory. It's a tool.
Right.
It's a tool to help explain a particular phenomenon. But when we become, sycophants,
Right.
That's when we get into trouble.
Yeah. One of the things that I find really different now than when I started this almost 30 years ago, there seemed to be an excitement amongst Black students about the presence of a Black Studies department and Black Studies courses and Black professors. I almost feel these days is that it doesn't matter as much to students. They could take it or leave it, right? And in fact, I find it remarkable, say someplace at Duke, how few Black students I actually see. Right. If I'm teaching a course, right, I see a significant amount of non-Black students. What do you think that says? I don't know if that's your experience at Northwestern, right? Even as a dean.
Yeah.
What do you think that says about how this younger generation of students value the work that we do?
I think it's owing to a number of things. I think social media, one. a lot of knowledge is garnered, disseminated on Twitter. For instance, there are a lot of debates on Black Twitter. I think there are a number of students who, and this is really fascinating to me, we saw this particularly during COVID and post George Floyd. Black students at a PWI, I'm talking about Northwestern, who did not want white students in the
Classes, right.
at all.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to do those kind of gymnastics in my own head. Like, you decided to come to a PWI and you don't want white students in the class. Okay. And it's that kind of essentialism that I think is, it's worrisome. Because it's also ahistorical. Because white folks, even though they benefited from systemic and structural racism, were also a part of the fight for freedom.
Absolutely.
And knowledge is helpful to everybody, even the Black folks who think they know everything about being Black,
Right.
and they don't. In terms of students, they're trafficking in and out of Black Studies courses. I don't know, because I think we're in a weird moment. We don't understand the implications of COVID and what it did to us, and how we're going to see that unfold over the next few years.
Right.
I think folks are still living in a place of trauma.
Yeah.
Because it was a culmination of a lot of things at once. It was COVID, it was George Floyd, it was Donald Trump. That's a lot.
Right.
at
17, 18, 19 years old, right?
So looking at a screen, dealing with an authoritarian regime in a global pandemic, and you witness the murder of Black folk.
Yeah.
So it's a lot, and I think young people are trying to figure out a number of things.
I've been, when we think about students who are coming through our classes now, particularly Black students, but not only Black students, there's a way that I teach now. I was joking with my class about this last night. There's some language that I don't use in casual conversation, but I do use performatively in the classroom, right, to make certain kind of intellectual points. We're now hearing folks, I know our colleagues at Cornell have been dealing with this, students want trigger warnings. And I've never felt comfortable, one, as a professor, being limited with the tools that I can use in the classroom, hence the language I can use in the classroom to make points, but also having gone through this experience myself, or thinking about the folks who went through it before us, where folks had no concerns for our feelings, right?
Exactly.
What does it mean that we go from folks who had to withstand all kinds of things in the classroom and at the university to folks now wanting trigger warnings, for what we teach and how we teach it? Yeah,
I think we're just showing our age. We become those professors. Because, I sometimes jokingly say, I ain't put no trigger warning on my syllabus. I'm triggered every day. I'm a Black gay man in America. I'm triggered every time I walk outside my house, That's just life, I have to deal with it. And I will also say this, because I don't want to come across as being insensitive to the really serious mental health crisis that students are going through right now.
Right.
But I also think that it's a generation of parents who are our age and older, who have coddled their children so much that they don't know what it means to have to deal with any kind of obstacle.
Right.
I was joking about this just the other day with some friends, because as dean, I have parents emailing me I'm like, my mama dropped me off at college. I didn't see her again till I came home
For
from spring
Thanksgiving.
break or whatever it
Right.
was.
Yep,
And then
yep.
at graduation,
Yep.
she didn't know who my dean was, didn't care, didn't know what I was doing.
Didn't know what classes you were taking. Nope.
But that is not these students' experience now. And I don't think it's helpful because they don't know how to navigate in the world.
Yeah.
And so I think it's incumbent upon adults to allow these young people to fail. And I use that word intentionally because failure is just a moment to regroup and retry the experiment.
Right.
And what are we doing other than experimenting at the university?
Right.
So but because we live in such a litigious time too, you know, I find myself censoring
Yep.
because I don't want nobody coming for me. Because I even though as dean, I'm still teaching. So it's these are perilous times up in these academic streets.
You mentioned that you're dean of communications at Northwestern. You've done administration before. How has that experience been different for you? Is it what you expected it would be? And I think the real question we ask for any Black administrators, right, is do you think your presence in that role is actually having an impact?
I do think my role is having and has had an impact. I didn't want the job. I turned it down twice.
And I think those are actually the best administrators,
Yeah.
right? Folks who aren't really looking to, like, whenever somebody says, I want to be a department chair, I'm like, okay, we need to be suspicious of you because nobody would want that.
No. And I've been department chair twice, once of performance studies, once of African American studies. And I think because I'm a type A personality, I'm very organized, whatever, I get a lot of things done. But administration has not been something that I pursued.
Right.
It's just been something I've been asked to do. So with the dean position, again, I said no a couple of times to the search firm, and then I feel like I got hoodwinked into throwing my hat in the ring, and it was horrible. Yeah. I became dean August 1st, 2020.
Oh.
So I had all the things, and I went to a very dark place emotionally because it was so much to be stuck at home in front of Zoom 10 to 12 hours dealing with budget cuts and hiring freezes and all of the social justice stuff going on, and it was just crazy.
Students masking up in classrooms.
Yeah, it was not fun. And so that first year was really trying. But the turning point for me was February of 21. At Northwestern, deans are required to do these, they're called strategy meetings. I don't know why they're called strategy meetings, because it's basically the meeting where you go ask for more money.
Right.
And in preparation for that, you have to sort of list your accomplishments up to that point. When I looked at what I had accomplished from August to February, I was astonished.
Yeah.
And I then realized that I was the right person at the right time.
Okay.
Because I keep going back to my hometown, my community, my upbringing. My mother and my grandmother were both domestic workers. And the ways I saw them having to maneuver on the other side of the track, because there's a railroad track that still exists that runs through Hickory that divides the black side of town and the white side of town. I used to go with my mother over to she worked for the Olsons. And I saw the way she had to maneuver and the ways in which she was seen and not seen.
Right.
I carry that with me into spaces like this. where I'm looking for the brother, sister who are cleaning the office.
Right.
Because that was my mama.
Right.
That was my grandmother. And so one of the things that I took with me into this role as dean is paying attention to the least of these.
Yeah.
And so I told the faculty, the folks who clean the offices that we teach and do research in are the folks that I'm going to be focusing on, because staff salaries were horrible.
Yep.
Just saying thank you.
Right.
Just seeing people. And so that kind of ethos is what I brought with me into this position. And it has been transformative in emotional ways, but also in material ways as well. And I've done a lot of hiring of Black and brown folk, because I had one department that is the oldest department in my school, had never had a Black person on the faculty in its 150-year-old history.
Wow.
And they in 2020, they were still saying, we don't have any Black faculty. So now there are 3 Black women in that department. So one of the things I know for sure is, despite my not wanting to do this kind of job, I know it's important that people like us do them.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not just about having a seat at the table. It's about having a position where you can affect some change.
Yeah.
And I tell people, because, as academics, we're trained to be suspicious of administration. We just are.
Right.
And, many people say, oh, you've gone to the dark side. And I say, in response, it's only dark if you don't take any light. It's not just a naturally dark place.
Right.
So we need to be everywhere to transform these spaces so that everybody is lifted up. And that's what I've been trying to do.
Have you felt a sense of isolation? And I know you're E. Patrick Johnson, right? So I know what your networks look like. But one of the things that struck me when I first became a chair, had really kind of collegial, friendly relationships with everybody in the department. Once I became chair, right, they're not your friends anymore.
Correct.
Right. They're folks who need something from you. I can imagine that's on a whole nother level.
It is.
Right. As a dean, where do you find the network of peers, right, where you can just talk about what it is, right, to deal with the realities of being a dean?
That was one of the most difficult transitions I had to make, because I had been on the faculty for 20 years before I became dean, and your relationships necessarily have to change. And it's a lonely space. But thank goodness I have other colleagues who are also deans. So, for instance, John Jackson and I have a standing meeting once a month.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just, shooting shit.
Keying. Yep.
But it's so important just to have that space, because, I can't, talk to colleagues about stuff that's going on. And I certainly can't talk to them about some of their other colleagues, and you need a space to do that. The other thing that's been really helpful to me is I have an executive coach.
Okay.
It was so important. And that's like my biweekly therapy. Because she helps me stay grounded and helps me be focused on my legacy.
Yeah.
Even when all the stuff around me is on fire, she's like, but what is your legacy, and how are you pursuing what you want to leave behind? Drown out all that noise. So that's been very helpful. And Dwight McBride and Earl Lewis have started this Academic Leadership Institute for Black and brown administrators. And I was a part of the inaugural class in 21, and that was amazing, because that also gave me an even broader network of administrators that I can say, can we just chat? Can we talk? So that's been very helpful.
What's next for you, E. Patrick?
Retirement. I want to sit down somewhere. One of the things that I want to do, and I'm serious about retirement, but one of the things I want to do is a memoir.
Yeah.
And as you know me, it's not going to be like your typical memoir.
Right. And you're going to have to be able to take it on the road and perform it on stage, right?
Exactly. I want to do a memoir that is really a biography of my mother. My mother, unbeknownst to all of us, she lived in the same apartment for 32 years.
Wow.
2-bedroom apartment. And you know, some of my siblings say that Mom was a hoarder, and I say she was an archivist. She had lots of stuff, but, and I understand now where I get my type A personality. Everything was organized.
Yeah.
So when we were cleaning out my mother's apartment, we found these boxes. They were all individual boxes with things from each of her children. She had a box for each of her children. In my box, there were letters that I had sent to her from college. There were playbills from performances. My driving license certificate. I mean, all these things. So I have this treasure trove of things that, and I didn't know. None of us knew that she had been keeping these things. The other thing is my mother had thousands of photographs, thousands, and they tell a story.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is do a kind of experimental memoir where I tell my life and my mother's life through her photographs. So I'm gonna have to, call Tita Campt and say how do I do this? But that's what I want to get to. And your former colleague Maurice Wallace just hit me up for an essay for a special issue of Literature and Religion that he's doing. And so I'm working on an essay for him on church sissies, of which I'm a proud member. So I'm doing my, for me, I couldn't do this administrative job without staying grounded.
Right, in the work, right.
In the work.
Yeah.
And leverage the position to continue to do the work. That's why I'm here today at Duke, doing a master class and still performing when I can, and still teaching. So I, got to keep it interesting because I have ideas.
Yeah. We've been joined today by E. Patrick Johnson, Dean of Communications at Northwestern University, where he's also the Annenberg Professor of Performance Studies and African American Studies, appearing for the 4th time on Left to Black. Thank you, E. Patrick.
It was my pleasure. Come back anytime.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything.